Benjamin F. Johnson was born July 28, 1818 in New York. He was one of 16 children born to his parents. They lived on a large farm. His father taught the children how to work and how to work hard. His mother, on the other hand, would focus her time and attention on teaching the children things of a more spiritual nature. She would teach those children faith and reliance on the Lord Jesus Christ. She also taught a valuable lesson, which would serve Benjamin and his siblings well throughout the rest of their lives. And that was that if they prayed and asked God for help and guidance, the Lord would grant it to them. She was faithful in taking the children regularly to the local Presbyterian congregation for Sunday worships. At the age of 10, Benjamin's mind was caught up on everything religious. He was seeking out his own salvation. He was seeking out truth. He was even trying to repent of any sin that he may have committed that would keep him from God. About a year later, in 1829, at the age of 11, the family received an article in the newspaper. In that article, it was described that not far from where they were, but in upstate New York, there was a boy by the name of Joseph Smith who had found an ancient record which contained teachings of Jesus Christ, and he was in the process of translating it into the English language. Benjamin F. Johnson hoped that this story was true. In 1830, two of his older brothers were looking for employment. They went to Ohio to find a job. But while in Ohio, they found something much more valuable and important than work. They found missionaries that were teaching about the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. They were soon baptized, having embraced the testimony of the missionaries and finding a testimony of their own of the truthfulness of it. They sent a message, a letter back home to the family. It was not well received. They were concerned about what these brothers were up to, particularly Benjamin's father. Well, to help the family understand a little bit more about what they had found, these two older brothers then followed up that letter with the mailing of a copy of the Book of Mormon. Their mom took that Book of Mormon, and she was determined to read it and expose it as being a fraud so that she could tell her sons that they had been misled. Well, the father was so displeased with everything that was going on that the mother hid the book, kept it to herself, thinking that she would read it privately. She invited a few trusted family members and relatives to join her in trying to find out that this book, or to prove that this book was not true. They started to read it in secret, not letting her husband know, Benjamin's father. At this time in their family's history, Benjamin records this. But their reading, meaning the mother and the relatives, their reading of the Book of Mormon, but their reading soon led to marveling at the simplicity and purity of what they read, and at the spirit which accompanied it, bearing witness to its truth. After a few days of secrecy, I was permitted to meet with them, to hear it read, being then 13 years of age. And in listening, a feeling of the most intense anxiety came over me to learn more. It seemed as if I must hear it all before I could be satisfied, and the principle of faith began to spring up in my heart to believe it. This was in the early fall of 1831. Now, a bright hope began to arise in my heart, that there really was a living prophet on the earth, and my greatest fear was that it would not prove true. Soon after this gaining of a testimony that the Book of Mormon was true, the family was visited by missionaries. They invited the family to be baptized. Benjamin's mother and some of his siblings were, those who were old enough. Being only 13 years of age, though, Benjamin's father forbid him to be baptized. So at that time, he wasn't baptized along with some of the other, although some of the other families were. Now that some of the family was baptized members of the church, they decided and talked her husband into moving the family out to the Kirtland, Ohio area where they could be associated with other members of the church. Pictured here behind me is the Kirtland Temple. When the Johnsons arrived in Kirtland, they settled in what became known as the Kirtland Flats, a little community at the base of the hill from where the Kirtland Temple now stands. And when Benjamin arrived with his family, he was still pretty young, so he didn't have the privilege of helping with the construction of the Kirtland Temple. But three of his older brothers did. In fact, those three older brothers helped lay the cornerstone of the temple. Benjamin at this time is only 15 years old, and the men took a pause on building the Kirtland temple so that Joseph Smith could organize a group of them to take a journey with him all the way to Missouri. This group of men, under the direction of Joseph Smith, would become known as Zion's Camp. And Benjamin had a great desire to go with the prophet and march to and back from Missouri. But being only 15 years old, Joseph Smith pulled young Benjamin aside and explained to him that just being only 15 years old and not a baptized member of the church, that it may not be best for him to join in the journey. So Benjamin was left behind, but Joseph Smith made a special promise to Benjamin. He told Benjamin that simply because of his desire to join Zion's camp, that he would receive every blessing that would come to those who did actually march with Zion as part of Zion's camp. The year is now 1835. Benjamin is now 17 years old, and he finally is baptized a member of the Church of Jesus Christ by Lyman Johnson. His father still hadn't shown any interest in joining the church, and so his mother decided to separate from his father. Mom and dad separate. The mother stayed with the children in the Kirtland area, while their father moved to a very nearby town of Mentor, Ohio. Benjamin's father, though, although now separated from his mother, he was regarded not only by the family, but of the townspeople as well, as being a well-respected man and a great father. There was a missionary who was called by the church to go officially as a missionary back to New York, and specifically to the area where the Johnsons were from. He goes to 17-year-old young Benjamin, and he invites him to come as an unofficial companion back to New York to teach the gospel to relatives and friends and neighbors and other associates that he had left behind when they moved to Ohio. Benjamin was thrilled with this opportunity, and so he took his 200-mile march with this missionary, and he shared the gospel of Jesus Christ with those that he cared about so much back in New York. It wasn't long after that unfortunately Benjamin returned to Kirtland quite disappointed, as his friends and family members didn't receive his testimony or join the church at that particular time. But when he did return to Kirtland, he was invited by the prophet Joseph to join a group of by invitation only individuals and come and participate in what was known as the School of the Prophets. In the School of the Prophets, to this very small, exclusive group of individuals, Joseph Smith would teach. He would teach faith. He would teach about the revelations and doctrine. He would teach about church leadership. And Benjamin had an opportunity to sit at the feet of the prophet and be tutored by him personally. The time of the dedication of the Kirtland Temple was upon the saints. Just before the dedication of the temple, Joseph Smith had a great desire to gather together all those who had helped in the construction of the temple to pronounce upon them a blessing. Benjamin, having been young and not having the opportunity to be a worker on the Kirtland Temple, he stayed outside the temple and listened to what was happening inside the temple. Inside is where Joseph and Hiram Smith were pronouncing these blessings upon these individuals. He waited out on the front porch and listening in and having this great desire and wanting a blessing for his very own, but feeling not qualified because he wasn't one of the temple workers. Yet Hiram says to his brother, "Joseph, I believe there's another blessing to be given." Hiram walks to the back of the temple, or to the front of the temple, out the front door, and he finds young Benjamin Johnson there on the front porch. Benjamin then records in his journal what happened next. "When on the last day of blessings, I was standing by the door in the crowded congregation, and oh, how I had yearned for a blessing. And as the last blessing, apparently, was given, the prophet earnestly looked towards the door where I was standing and said to his brother Hiram, 'Go and see if there is not one more yet to be blessed.' Brother Hiram came to the door, and seeing me, put his hand upon my shoulder and asked me if I had not worked on the temple. I said, 'No, sir,' but it seemed like passing a sentence upon my fondest hopes. He then asked if I had done nothing towards it. I then thought of a new gun I had earned and given as a donation, and of the brick I had helped to make. I said, I did give often. I thought, he said, there was a blessing for you, and he almost carried me to the stand. The prophet blessed me with a confirmation of all his father, and sealed upon me and many more also. I felt then that the Lord had respected my great desire to be blessed. Even to be the youngest and the last to be blessed seemed me a high privilege. When the prophet had looked towards the door, I felt as though he would call for me, though I could not see how I had merited so high a privilege, but so it was, and my joy was full. A few days later, Benjamin would be privileged to be in the Kirtland temple at the time of dedication. He would testify of the angels and many other divine manifestations that so many would witness on that day of dedication. Shortly after the dedication of the Kirtland temple, apostasy crept into the Kirtland area. Many members of the church decided not to be members of the church, and not just to not be members, but to become enemies of the church. Of this time of the history, Benjamin would record this. In this day of great affliction and separation by apostasy, I felt to call mightily upon his name, that he would never leave me to follow these examples, but that he would keep me humble, even though in poverty and affliction, so that I fell not. This power of my youth I have never forgotten, neither do I feel that it is forgotten by him to whom it was made. Despite their financial destitution, they somehow were able to scrape up enough money, the Johnson family, to purchase a wagon and make the long, difficult journey to Missouri, following the prophet. When the Johnsons were finally able to leave Kirtland, Ohio together, they left on July 4th, 1838. Now, most of the members of the church who were wealthy had at this point apostatized. Those that could financially pull things together and make their way to Missouri on their own had already left. And so the Johnsons were some of the last to leave the Kirtland area. They joined together with 400 other people who were in a similar financial situation, and with their collective 60 wagons, they headed out west. They became known as the Kirtland Poor Camp. They consecrated together everything they had in order to make it work. Brother Johnson says this, but the blessing of the Lord was with us. Despite the financial hardship and the uncertainty of the future, he always trusted in the Lord. And one of his responsibilities as a member of this group was to go into town and to try to barter or secure provisions and food and things that would be necessary to help this company of 400 people. So he would gather from those 400 people some things that were not needed, and he would take them into town and barter for things that were needed. Well, one of these times near Dayton, Ohio, he was in a small little town. He had no coat. He didn't even have shoes on his feet. And so the townspeople started to take notice. Who are you? What are you doing here? Well, it wasn't long before 100 people had gathered around Benjamin Johnson, and he answered those questions: who he was, why he was there, and where he was going with this company. It gave him an opportunity to teach the gospel of Jesus Christ and to share his testimony. Even without a coat in the wintertime and no shoes on his feet, he was always teaching and testifying, never hiding his faith that he loved so much. As they made their way towards far west, where Joseph and the other saints had already gathered, they camped in a little settlement called Haun's Mill. Fortunately, they were there 10 days prior to what's become known as the Haun's Mill Massacre. Shortly after arriving in far west, Joseph Smith went and found his good friend, B.F. Johnson, and he gave him an assignment to relocate a little bit to the north in a valley which has been called Adam on Diamond. There, a community of saints had already gathered. About 1,000 of them were already there. And B.F. Johnson was sent by the prophet to Adam on Diamond to help strengthen and support that growing community. Pictured here behind me is a picture of the valley of Adam on Diamond. Now, B.F. Johnson, when he got there, he secured a piece of property, but he had no money. He had no house on that property. He had no food. He had no clothing. He had given it to everyone else in that Kirtland Poor Camp that he had traveled with. that upon arrival here in Adam-on-Diamond, he had literally nothing. He didn't even have a blanket to sleep on. He had very little winter clothing to help protect him from the elements. But he was there at the request and at the assignment of the prophet Joseph Smith, who he loved. He was assigned a member of the guard duty. So he was part of the group that would protect the 1,000 members of the church that were in and around this valley that's pictured here behind me. As part of the member of the guard duty, he snuck out one night, headed into a town to secure some food and provisions that would be necessary and important to those that were there in Adam-on-Diamond. For they had been surrounded by some Missourians who weren't very fond of the members of the church being there. And so those members of the church were fearful of their lives, and B.F. Johnson was there to protect them and to help feed and clothe them the best that he could. Now, the call from the prophet to the saints up in Adam-on-Diamond was to come and gather with the other saints in far west Missouri. The difficulties of Missouri were increasing, and it was starting to get scary, and so the prophet wanted everybody to come and be centralized there in far west together. B.F. Johnson, though, was placed under arrest by those unruly mob members near and around Adam-on-Diamond. He was in confinement for 7 days. He was in the snow, he was freezing, he was hungry, given very little food to eat, when he was finally eventually able to escape. He escaped and made his way towards far west, but he had a long, wintry journey ahead of him. How he wished for just one small match so that he could make a small little fire to get warm for a few minutes. He placed his hands inside his pocket, and to his surprise, there was one singular match found in the pocket. He recognized this as a miracle and a blessing from his loving Heavenly Father. When he finally got to far west, the prophet and Hiram had already been arrested and taken off towards Liberty Jail. The saints were now making preparations to leave Missouri and head east towards the state of Illinois. During this time of preparation, the mob from Adam-on-Diamond were still looking for B.F. Johnson, and so to protect himself, he had to take a few provisions and hide out in the wilderness, coming into town occasionally to help the saints gather themselves together and make their preparations to leave the state of Missouri. Well, during this time, as everything was happening, Elder Heber C. Kimball came to Brother Johnson and ordained him an elder at the young age of 19. Elder Kimball also invited him, B.F. Johnson, to join Elder Kimball and others who were destined to go to England in the following spring. B.F. Johnson was flattered at the invitation to do so, and he was greatly looking forward to this wonderful opportunity. He made that difficult journey east across the state of Missouri, finally ending up in Quincy, Illinois, where he was reunited with family members and friends. During this time of his life, looking back on it, he reflects with this quote: "In looking back over the difficulties through which I had passed in that short period, it seemed more like a dream than a reality. And when I think of it all as real, I feel a weight of gratitude to God that I find no words to express." Shortly after arriving in Quincy, Brother Johnson, his mother, and sisters relocated to Springfield, Illinois. That's because Benjamin found a job out there. And so while he was out there in Springfield, Illinois, working and helping to financially support his family, he met a woman. He quickly fell in love with this girl, as she did with him. They decided that they wanted to get married. This woman, she wasn't a member of the church, but she had quite a bit of wealth. So much wealth that it would easily provide a lifestyle of comfort and ease that Benjamin had never experienced before. He made it a matter of prayer. And reflecting on this time of his life, Benjamin says this: "I pondered the matter prayerfully, and I could not but feel that to marry a woman with wealth would be to bring myself to the world, and would keep me from my mission. And if allured away from my calling in the gospel, then all the new and bright hopes that had wakened within me would become a failure. I felt it would be a sacrifice too great, even for a lovely wife with inheritance of wealth." So he didn't marry her. Shortly after this, he received a letter from Elder Kimball, Heber C. Kimball. And in that letter, Elder Kimball was reminding Benjamin of the great promise that Elder Kimball had previously made to him, an invitation to join the apostles on a mission to Europe. Well, Benjamin read that letter, and in that letter, he also discovered that the saints had found for themselves a gathering place, a place that would later become known as Nauvoo. Benjamin, he quickly headed off to what would become known as Nauvoo. He found the saints, most of them, sick, crazy sick, and Benjamin became their nurse. Not having been among the saints for that time, he didn't catch the diseases and the sicknesses and illnesses that they were suffering with. So, as the healthy one in town, he took care of the rest. Well, eventually, Brother Johnson, he would find himself sick. And the prophet Joseph Smith came and found his good friend Benjamin and invited Benjamin to come to the prophet's home where he could rest and recuperate. The prophet Joseph Smith would be the nurse taking care of Benjamin at this time. Well, the friendship that they had up to this point in Benjamin's life, it grew. And he and the prophet Joseph became even more close through this experience. From that moment on, Joseph Smith referred to Benjamin Franklin Johnson simply as Benny. Such an affectionate name for somebody that he cared so much for. Well, shortly after Benny recovered from his illness, the prophet Joseph Smith got sick, and Benjamin became the prophet's primary caretaker. Later, he received a letter from his mother and his sisters saying that they were sick and needed his help back in Springfield, Illinois. So as he made preparations to depart Nauvoo for Springfield, Illinois to take care of his family, he left with nothing more than tattered clothes and $10 in his pocket. He went to the prophet Joseph Smith on his way out of town to pay his tithing and to say goodbye to his good friend. Just as he was leaving Joseph Smith's house, Joseph Smith called Benny back, and he pronounced upon his head a blessing. And in that blessing, the prophet Joseph Smith promised Benny that an angel would accompany Benjamin through all of his journey throughout life, and that angel would bring comfort and protection to him. Now, throughout the rest of his life, which would be many, many more years, Benjamin would always see miracles in his life and attribute those miracles being delivered from the Lord, but by that personal angel that had been promised to him by the prophet Joseph Smith. Well, the time came for the apostles to head on their mission over to Europe. Benny, of course, was invited to go with them, but as they were departing Nauvoo, Brother Johnson was sick and unable to go. So instead of heading with the apostles to Europe, he was reassigned to a mission in the eastern states. In February of 1840, with just $12.50 in his pocket, he headed east to preach the gospel. This was an incredibly physically demanding journey back east. It was cold, the weather was horrible, and he did his very best to make his way out there. He describes that experience as this: only 21 years of age, I was alone, sick, and among strangers, without money, the mud deep, weather stormy, without education or mission experience, and bashful beyond the power of words to tell. Yet I did not wish myself back. The Lord had brought me carefully through an experience calculated to teach me that it would not do to depend upon my own wisdom and strength. And as for my own capability, it was really as nothing. And if the Lord had ceased to care for me, I was of little worth. I told the Lord I had taken that mission because I was told to by his servants. And if there was anything a poor, ignorant boy could do to please him, I was willing to try and do my best. But if he left me alone, I was certain I could accomplish nothing. The first sermon that he preached to a large group of interested individuals back there in the eastern states was an hour and a half in length. He preached the entire sermon with his eyes completely shut. He was truly as bashful as he admitted, and he couldn't dare look upon this congregation. So he preached with his eyes closed the next several sermons as well, until his confidence grew and he was finally able to open his eyes and look at the congregation as he preached to them. With his eyes open or closed, it really didn't matter. His testimony was strong, and those in the congregation believed his words to be true. Many of them asked Brother Johnson for baptism. This mission through the eastern states would take him to Philadelphia, up into Toronto, Canada, and all throughout Pennsylvania. He came across a tribe of Native Americans. He learned to speak their language. And in communicating with the Indian chief, he discovered that they had a tradition among themselves, that their fathers were cursed because of their wars and their unrighteousness. But they also had a tradition among their tribe that one day a prophet would come among them and teach them the truth, which would therefore lift that curse. Benjamin F. Johnson recognized this Indian tribe as descendants of the Lamanites, with some of those wonderful blessings promised to them by a loving Heavenly Father. He ended up back in Kirtland, Ohio. There, he was familiar with the area and some of the residents that still resided there. There was a small branch of members of the church, and so he took it upon himself to do all that he could to strengthen that branch of the members there in Kirtland. He also made a living for himself there by opening up a saddlery shop, where he was quite successful. While in Kirtland, he also met and would later marry Melissa LeBaron. They married there in Kirtland. In fact, they had the wedding ceremony in the home that was once owned and occupied by the prophet Emma and their family. In June of 1842, Benjamin F. Johnson, and now with his wife Melissa, they made their way back to Nauvoo. Pictured here behind me is the mansion house in Nauvoo. This was where Joseph and Emma and their family lived the latter part of Joseph's life here in Nauvoo. And I have it pictured here in this video because Benjamin would spend an awful lot of time in this home with his best friend, the prophet Joseph Smith. Upon returning to Nauvoo, Joseph Smith found his trusted friend, and he gave him a very important assignment. He was to be the trustee for the church, which meant that he would be in charge of buying and selling properties for the church, and his name would be attached to those transactions. While busy working for the church and doing his other church responsibilities and now helping to raise his own personal family, Brigham Young called him on an assignment to go oversee several small branches in the city of Pittsburgh. Well, Joseph Smith heard about this assignment that was given to him by Brigham Young, and Joseph Smith tells Benny, "You go back and tell Brigham Young to send someone else." Joseph needed Benjamin in Nauvoo. Benjamin was valuable to the prophet Joseph, and he needed Benjamin to be working side by side with him. Joseph Smith would spend a lot of time at Benjamin's house. Benjamin would spend a lot of time at Joseph Smith's house. He had an opportunity to sit in private conversation with the prophet Joseph Smith and ask him questions and be taught doctrine. In one of these visits here to the home, Benjamin's mother came with him. The prophet Joseph Smith blessed Benjamin's mother with such a blessing as this, that none of her children would ever fall away or leave the church. Benjamin was present when Joseph Smith taught some of the more famous doctrinal speeches there in Nauvoo, and those would include sermons on priesthood authority and power. He was also there when Joseph would reveal and teach the doctrine about proxy work for the dead. He was there when Joseph would teach about the importance of the temple and many other important and significant doctrines. Just before Joseph and his brother Hiram would depart Nauvoo for Carthage jail, where they would give their lives as martyrs, he was in a meeting with Joseph Smith and members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. Of that meeting, Benjamin records the following. At one of the meetings, in the presence of the Quorum of the 12 and others, who were encircled around him, meaning the prophet Joseph, he arose, gave a review of his life and sufferings, and of the testimonies he had borne, and said that the Lord had now accepted his labors and sacrifices and did not require him any longer to carry the responsibilities and burden and bearing of this kingdom. Turning to those around him, including the 12, Joseph said, "And in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, I now place it upon my brethren of this council, and shake my skirts clear of all responsibility from this time forth." After the martyrdom of the prophet Joseph and his brother Hiram in the Carthage jail, the members of the church in Nauvoo were left with a question: who would now lead the church? Sidney Rigdon came forth and answered that question by laying claim that he was the rightful leader of the church. In this meeting, Brigham Young would also speak to the members of the church. Benjamin was present during this meeting when the two of them spoke, and he recorded of that instance with this. And so matters stood until the return of the 12, when a conference was assembled and President Rigdon was called upon to put forth his claim before the people, which he did. And after closing his remarks, which were void of all power or influence, President Brigham Young arose and spoke. I saw him arise, but as soon as he spoke, I jumped to my feet. For in every possible degree, it was Joseph's voice, and his person, in look, attitude, dress, and appearance, was Joseph himself personified. And I knew in a moment the spirit and mantle of Joseph was upon him. Then I remembered his saying to the council, of which Sidney Rigdon was never a member, and I knew for myself who was now the leader of Israel. New confidence and joy continued to spring up within me, and the subject of our finding a new home in the wilderness of the Great West was one that occupied much of my thoughts. The Quorum of the 12 asked Brother Johnson to move his family into Joseph's mansion house. Emma was occupying a different home there in Nauvoo at the time. His responsibility of living in the mansion house was to keep it up and to even rent out portions of the house to others. During this time, he was also given a great responsibility, in that of being called as captain of 50. In other words, he was to be in charge of 50 individuals who were preparing at that time to make the journey out west. He had to help them become prepared physically for that lengthy journey. Shortly before Brother Johnson and his family left Nauvoo, he, along with Newell K. Whitney, paid a visit to Emma Smith. Throughout the entirety of the whole night, Brother Johnson and Brother Whitney pled and tried to persuade Emma to join the saints in moving west. Of course, they weren't successful, and Emma, her children, and Joseph's mother would stay behind in Nauvoo as the saints went out west. The Johnson family was one of the very first to leave Nauvoo. They left on February 6, 1846. The first stop along the incredibly long journey would be just the other side of the Mississippi River in a camp that they called Sugar Creek Camp. It's Sugar Creek Camp that is pictured here behind me. It may not look exactly as it did back in those days. It's probably much more overgrown today than it was then. But this is the place where Johnson and the rest of this early saints settled temporarily as they made their final preparations for the West. Just a couple of miles from this campsite is Nauvoo, just the other side of the river. It was incredibly difficult. It was a horrible place or time to be camping in this place. It was very cold. It was very muddy. Lots of people were sick. There was no shelter. And the only thing that they could eat were corn and beans. It's all they had available to eat. And those two things, corn and beans, made Benjamin very, very sick. His stomach couldn't handle those two items of food. And you think of it, just a moment ago, just the day before this camp out began, Brother Johnson and his family were living just a short distance away in the finest home in all of Nauvoo. Under such miserable conditions as they would end up camping here at Sugar Creek Camp for over a month, he gathered his family together to hold a family council. What do we do? They decided in unison, a unanimous vote among family members, that they would press forward, that they wouldn't go back to the mansion house, but that they would continue on the journey, trusting in the Lord. After a month of being in Sugar Creek, they were able to finally make their way out of there and continue on their journey west. He says, yet, reflecting on that month here at Sugar Creek, he says, yet there was a warm feeling in our hearts as we trusted in God. The irony of him using that descriptive word, that there was a warm feeling in our hearts. It was February. The coldest night of their month-long camp out here at Sugar Creek, it reached negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit. But they would pursue their journey west, following and trusting in the Lord. Now you'll remember that all they had available to eat was corn and beans. and it made Benjamin very, very sick. So he offered a prayer to the Lord to help him with this problem. He said, I had told the Lord that by his help I would fulfill every requirement, and if it was his will that I should live to be his servant, he must cause my food to assimilate to the conditions of my stomach, which I know he did. And he was able to thereby eat corn and beans, simple as it was, without a stomach ache moving forward. Well, as they continued on, the weather didn't get better. It was still winter storms. It was cold. It was muddy. And now among the saints, the measles broke out. And so now everybody was sick. It was a really tough, difficult situation. So much so that Brother Johnson was looking for an opportunity to keep his family warm. He took his prized family heirloom chest and chopped it up and used it for firewood. Along the journey, they made another camp at a place called Garden Grove. This was in Iowa. And Brigham Young asked Brother Johnson and his family to remain in Garden Grove, plant a farm, and have crops available and ready for those saints who would later be coming from Nauvoo behind this first initial group. So Brother Johnson, to be obedient to the prophet, he went into town with all of his worldly goods, all of his possessions, and he sold everything he had and purchased seeds and farm equipment so that he could grow crops for others who would come later behind him. One winter, as he's journeying across the West, he finds that there's a bunch of men out on a lake, and they're ice fishing. They're trying to find fish. Brother Johnson and his family and other members of the Pioneer Company, they were hungry. They were starving. And having fish would be a real treat. But the men out there couldn't find any fish. It was as though there were no fish in that lake. So Brother Johnson watched those men as they were out there doing their very best to fish until they had all gone home. And after the sun had set and all the men were gone, Brother Johnson went to those fishing holes and he let down his nets and he pulled out more fish than he was able to fit in his entire wagon. He took all those fish back, fed his family and the other members of the Pioneer Company, and they thanked God for such a blessing. After leaving winter quarters now, so he went from Sugar Creek to Garden Grove to winter quarters. After leaving winter quarters, destined now for the Salt Lake Valley, they left on July 4th, 1848. And of this portion, from winter quarters to the Salt Lake Valley, all that's recorded of that journey is simply this from Brother Johnson. There were but few prominent incidences pertaining to this journey of my own history. Finally, on October 22nd, 1848, the Johnson family arrived in the Salt Lake Valley. They arrived with a little bit of flour. They determined that if they were to ration the flour between the family members, in which each family member would be able to enjoy 4 ounces of flour per day, they might make the flour last all the way to the next harvest season. So Brother Johnson got to work. He needed to take care of his family. So using the skills and the talents that he had developed earlier in his life, he opened up a shop where he made and sold saddles and harnesses for horses. During this time of great physical challenges in the Johnson household, they lost a child. They had to bury a child, and this sent Sister Johnson into grief and pain and sorrow. Brother Johnson gave his wife a blessing. And in that blessing, he promised Sister Johnson that soon they would welcome a baby boy into their family. It wasn't long after that blessing that the prophecy and the blessing were fulfilled. And they welcomed a baby boy into the family. They named him Joseph Ezekiel Johnson. On the very day that the Johnsons ran out of flour and they had absolutely nothing to eat, a group of immigrants entered the Salt Lake Valley, heading further west than the valley. And they started to inquire about where they could purchase saddles and harnesses for their horses. Well, Brother Johnson was the only one in the valley that at the time was making and selling saddles and harnesses for horses. So the immigrants came, they paid him a large sum of money in exchange for those saddles and harnesses. And on that same day in which the food ran out, Brother Johnson was able to secure with that the money from the immigrants food to take care of his family. Brigham Young, he decided that he wanted to leave the Salt Lake Valley and go on an exploratory journey to the surrounding areas to see if there might be a place or places in which the saints could settle and start to grow and develop other communities. He invited Benjamin Franklin Johnson to join him on this journey. They went as far south as present-day Cedar City, and on their way back home, back north, they came to a little part of their journey in which Benjamin made comment to Brigham Young of how beautiful this place looked and how nice it was and how this spot could be a great place for a community of saints. Brigham Young then turned to Benjamin and invited him to be the one to settle that particular area. This was a difficult invitation for Benjamin and his family to accept from the prophet. Back home, near where Salt Lake City was being grown and developed, he had the harness and saddlery shop. He had the only drugstore in the Salt Lake Valley. He had a beautiful house, lots of land, and a big farm. So in 1852, in being obedient to the direction and invitation of Brigham Young, the Johnsons sold all of it. And they moved to this particular place in the middle of nowhere to start completely over. They nicknamed the place Summit Creek. Later, it would become known as Sanquin, Utah. After just a few months since their arrival in Summit Creek, Brother Johnson was called on a mission. This time, he would be called to serve as a missionary in the Hawaiian Islands. He was given just 10 days' notice for him to take care of his family, gather his belongings, and be on his way. The boat ride from San Francisco Bay to Honolulu was somewhat eventful. He gives us this quote: "Our passage to Honolulu occupied 16 days, with weather just rough enough to give us the full benefit of seasickness." I love that quote because it gives us a little peek into the personality of Brother Johnson. Once he arrived in Honolulu, he found that the work was incredibly difficult. It was mainly because of the language. The Hawaiian language was difficult to understand. It was even more difficult to speak. He decided to write a letter to the king. And in this letter, he described what the missionaries were doing there in the islands, what their intentions were. And he also included in the letter some points of doctrine of the restored gospel. The Hawaiian king was very impressed with Brother Johnson's letter, so he had it translated into the Hawaiian language. And with the English version and the Hawaiian version being distributed among all the locals there in Hawaii. Well, from those letters, the work progressed rapidly. A lot of people had a lot of interest in hearing from the missionaries and about the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. The work was still difficult, though, but with a lot of new members coming into the church, they found one big problem, and that was retention. A lot of these local Hawaiians would get excited about the gospel, they'd request to be baptized, and then they wouldn't come to church. So Brother Johnson had an inspired idea. He thought if they were to ordain local members of the church to the priesthood and call both women and men to leadership responsibilities within the church there in the islands, then that may help with the retention. And it did. It worked great. The members of the Hawaiian people were accepting the gospel, they were being baptized, and now, through this inspired program, they were staying active members of the church. On May 1st, 1853, Brother Johnson gathered a large group of individuals together for a meeting. These were non-members who had an interest in learning more about the church. He spoke for a couple of hours in a way that the locals were able to hear and understand and comprehend what Brother Johnson was speaking to them. At the end of the meeting, 100 local Hawaiians approached Brother Johnson and requested baptism. Later, in front of a large congregation, Brother Johnson would teach about priesthood power, priesthood authority, and priesthood power. He taught them that the priesthood power that the Savior had during his mortal ministry had been restored to the earth, and that it could be used for the same purposes. People got really excited. They came with their sick and their afflicted. They came with people who were hurt and in all sorts of infirmities, and they brought them to Brother Johnson and asked that he use the priesthood power, which they now had a testimony of, to bless their loved ones. Of this experience, Brother Johnson says, This morning, as usual, I administered to many sick who thronged the house, and we witnessed the power of God greatly manifest. Some are healed who for months had been afflicted, some even for years, and they go forth joyfully into the waters of baptism. 1 year into his mission in the Hawaiian Islands, Brother Johnson received a letter. In that letter, he was told, unfortunately, that his mother, his sister, and two of his children had passed away. Brother Johnson debated what to do. He decided to stay in the mission field and continue serving the Lord, even under those trying circumstances. Not long after his 1 year anniversary in the Hawaiian Islands, he was called, sustained, and set apart as first counselor to the mission president. One of his main assignments in that responsibility was to find a location for the gathering of the saints in not just Hawaii, but all of the Polynesian areas as well and countries. They wanted to have a gathering place where these new saints could come together and live in a community, similarly as the saints had done in Kirtland, in Nauvoo, and now in Salt Lake City. Brother Johnson went out and he found a suitable location. He named that location Joseph, or the city of Joseph. The time that the saints were gathered in the city of Joseph was short-lived, and eventually they would abandon that settlement and go find a new settlement, in which they would call it Laie. Pictured here behind me is the coastline there of the city of Laie in Hawaii today. When Benjamin was called to serve as a missionary, he was coming behind some of the first missionaries to the Hawaiian Islands. One of the first missionaries was George Q. Cannon. While George Q. Cannon was there during an earlier period of time than Brother Johnson, he translated the Book of Mormon into the Hawaiian language. However, there is no press sufficiently large enough or capable of printing the Book of Mormon in the Hawaiian language there in the Hawaiian Islands. So Brother Cannon had purchased a printing press and had it shipped to Honolulu. It took several months. Brother Cannon was released from his mission and sent back home to Salt Lake City. And then eventually the press arrived in Honolulu. Now with the press in Honolulu, but the manuscript of the Hawaiian Book of Mormon in San Francisco, Parley P. Pratt requested that Benjamin F. Johnson return from serving as a missionary in Hawaii and escort that printing press back to San Francisco, which he did. And that would conclude his Hawaiian mission. During that journey across the ocean from Honolulu to San Francisco, there were several problems with that journey and on the ship. One, namely, was the storms. It rained and the wind blew the entire time, bringing back a lot of that sickness, I'm sure. The other problem is that a fire broke out and nearly sunk the ship. Fortunately, the passengers and the crew were able to extinguish the fire. And then, unfortunately, the captain was robbed of $300. So when they pulled into the port there in San Francisco, the captain wouldn't let anybody off the ship. He went and found the police, brought the police on board, and instructed the police to search everyone, all the individuals, and see who the thief of the $300 was. When the police started their interrogations and started searching each individual, the captain came back and said, "Hold on just a minute. Don't search Benjamin F. Johnson." The captain requested that the police do not interrogate or search Brother Johnson because what the captain said is he had come to know of Brother Johnson's integrity, and surely it could not have been him that stole the $300. In March of 1855, 2 years after leaving his family, Brother Johnson returned to Summit Creek, Utah. Once back home, Brother Johnson remained very busy. He continued to settle the area of Summit Creek, renaming it to Santaquin, what it's known by today. He would also be elected as a state legislature. This would take him to Fillmore, which was the city in which the capital of the territory was located. While there, working as a state legislature, one of his main responsibilities was to help draft the Constitution for the state of Deseret. This would be a major step forward in obtaining statehood for what would become known as Utah. In 1856, however, there was a scarcity of food throughout the area. There wasn't much food for anybody to eat. The Johnsons were blessed and fortunate enough to have 2 large bags of flour and nothing else. They prayed to the Lord and promised that if he would allow that flour to last, they would never turn away anyone who asked for it. Many family members, friends, neighbors, and others would come to the Johnsons asking for a little bit of flour, and they gave freely of what they had. Those 2 bags of flour lasted throughout the entire food scarcity, although they gave away much more than what 2 bags could hold. One general conference, Brother Johnson made his way to Salt Lake City. He sat in the tabernacle and he listened to Elder Heber C. Kimball preach. During that sermon from Elder Kimball asked for a donation to be given by those at the conference for a particular cause. Brother Johnson had a few small amounts of money in his pocket. That money was required in order to pay his passage to get back to Santaquin, to get back home. But he was obedient to the call of Elder Kimball to donate to this particular cause, giving all the money that he had in his pants pocket. Walking out of the tabernacle, not knowing how he was going to get home, he came across a man that he recognized from years earlier, a man that he had suspected never to have seen again. Years before, Brother Johnson had loaned this man a particular amount of money. This man, recognizing Brother Johnson, embraced him, and he said, "I have the money I owe you." He pulled out from his pocket money and gave it to Brother Johnson, which equated to 4 times the amount of money that he had just donated at the asking of Elder Kimball. Back home in Santaquin, business was doing well. In fact, Brother Johnson had his hands in a lot of different businesses. He was farming, he had a sawmill, he still had his saddlery shop, and he was now into shoemaking. But as prosperity came into the Johnson family home, the sawmill was burned to the ground, and all the other businesses were destroyed by thieves. Everything had been taken and stolen from him. At this moment of his life, he records of his destituted situations, "I wrote these things so that my children's children may better comprehend the struggles of those who, in their poverty, obeyed the command of God in that early day, in the increase of their families. They trusted in the Lord, and the Lord would bless them." In 1862, another food scarcity came throughout the surrounding area. The Johnsons were without money, or without food, or money to buy food. They knelt down and they prayed that a way might be made that they could feed their family. Just then, Brother Johnson had received a notice from a friend living in Nephi, just south of Santaquin. And that friend had written in this letter, "Brother Johnson, I have excess amount of wheat. Could you use some of it?" Brother Johnson, of course, readily and quickly replied, "Yes, we could use some of it." And just a few days after that, this friend from Nephi showed up at the Johnson family home with a wagon full of wheat, the Lord having taken care of the Johnsons in their most desperate time of need. Brother Johnson records, "Our prospects for food and common comforts were dark as death, but our trust in the Lord was not disappointed." Brother Johnson also had family, extended family, some brothers and others who were living in the St. George area. And as often as he could, he would make his way to St. George to visit those family members. The St. George Temple was being built, and now it was ready to be dedicated, and Brother Johnson was able to attend that temple dedication. While in St. George, he met with his friend Brigham Young at the time of the dedication of the St. George Temple. And Brigham Young assigned Brother Johnson to go to the surrounding communities around southern and central Utah and to preach to the members of the church the doctrines of the temple, and to serve and to serve to them an invitation to come to the temple. Brother Johnson did that. He spent a lot of his time in St. George and the surrounding communities between there and his own home, preaching that very message that Brigham Young sent him to preach about the temple, about the doctrine, about the need to go to the temple and the necessity to do the temple work for their ancestors. In 1877, Brother Johnson was back home in Santaquin when Elder Taylor paid him a visit. Elder John Taylor extended the call to Brother Johnson to serve as bishop. He ordained him as such, and Brother Johnson would serve as the first bishop of the newly created First Ward there in Santaquin. In 1879, Brother Johnson had a brother living in Arizona. This brother encouraged Benjamin to come with his family and relocate in Arizona. He wanted to make sure that he was doing what the Lord wanted him to do. So Benjamin went to a good and trusted friend, Elder Snow, and asked him if he should move his family to Arizona. Elder Snow asked if he could take some time and visit with the members of the Quorum of the 12 about such an option. He did so and returned to Brother Johnson and explained to him that he was now called to serve a mission in Arizona to go help settle the area and strengthen the church that was down there. This time, he was not to go alone, but he was to take his entire family with him. So the whole Johnson family left Santaquin, Utah, and made their way south down to Tempe, Arizona, just outside of Mesa in the Phoenix area. In 1883, while residing down in Arizona, he was ordained a patriarch and started to give patriarchal blessings to the members of the church there in the area. One time, a couple of apostles from Salt Lake were visiting the members of the church in the area, and they decided that they wanted to go deep down into Mexico and explore opportunities for further settlements and to also preach the gospel. They invited Benjamin to go with them. While they were spreading the gospel throughout Mexico, they came upon one particular group of people that Brother Johnson in his journal makes mention of. He says that this group readily accepted our testimony as true and say that they shall wait with great anxiety for the book, meaning the Book of Mormon, to come to them in the Spanish language, and asked how soon they might expect it, with someone to teach them further. Because of the diligence, effort, and faith of Brother Johnson, the gospel was spreading now throughout Mexico. He returned to Tempe, and he spent his time there, mostly full-time, in giving patriarchal blessings to the members of the church there in that area. He then made an extended visit to St. George. There, he spent time with family, but spent most of his time working inside the newly dedicated St. George Temple. He did the work literally for thousands of ancestors, and he also helped other people in the area find thousands of their ancestors so that the work could be done for them as well. One night he saw a vision. In this vision, he saw countless people that were seeking after their own redemption. He heard a voice, in this vision, which said, "The Lord has heard your prayer and vow and has opened your way. These are your kindred. You now have the key of parentage, and it is yours in birthright to lead in their redemption. It is of the Lord in answer to your prayer." The prayer referred to in this vision that Benjamin had offered so frequently was that he would be able to find his ancestors and perform the temple ordinances for them. After 2 years of intense temple attendance, Benjamin left St. George and returned to his family in Tempe, Arizona. He's now 69 years old. He continues giving patriarchal blessings in the area, and he starts to slip into retirement mode. He spends time with his family. He cares and takes care of his large orchard, and he even became a beekeeper. He did muster up just enough strength now in his older age to make the long and difficult journey to the Salt Lake Valley. There he would attend the dedication of the Salt Lake Temple. After the dedication of the temple, he would return one final time to Tempe, Arizona, where he would peacefully pass away amongst his family on November 18, 1905, at the age of 87. Part of the obituary of Benjamin Franklin Johnson reads, "He was beloved by all who knew him. He had a pure love of God in his heart, which was abundantly manifest in his remarkable love for his fellow men."